Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where the night is long, the rain is steady, and the darkest stories unfold in whispers. Tonight, we step into a case defined not by patterns, but by absence. Long highways stretching through forests and snow. Small towns passed without stopping. Motels where no one remembers a face the next morning. Across the United States, lives ended with no connection, no warning, no visible thread tying them together. Different states, different victims, different years. What linked them was a man who planned in silence, burying evidence years before crimes were committed, choosing victims at random, and vanishing between maps and memories. His name was Israel Keyes, a man who believed control meant leaving no pattern behind. A killer who traveled constantly, hid his intentions carefully, and remained invisible until a single mistake brought him into the light. This is not a story about chaos. It is a story about patience, preparation, and the illusion that randomness provides safety. So let the rain fall. Let the road stretch endlessly into the dark. And settle in, as we begin the unsettling story of the Keyes murders, Israel Keyes. Long before investigators would struggle to map his movements across the United States, long before airports, rental cars, and buried caches became central to his myth, Israel Keyes existed in a place that felt far removed from modern infrastructure. He was born in 1978 into a family drifting through rural isolation, rooted in religious extremism and emotional neglect rather than physical location. His childhood unfolded across remote corners of the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest, far from cities, far from conventional education, and far from any consistent exposure to social norms. This early detachment would shape not only how he saw the world, but how effectively he learned to move through it unseen. Keyes grew up homeschooled in an environment defined by rigid belief systems and distrust of authority. His family rejected mainstream society, avoiding hospitals, public schools, and institutions viewed as corrupt or sinful. For a young boy, this created a warped sense of normalcy. Rules existed, but they were inconsistent. Punishment was unpredictable. Control was pervasive but not nurturing. Emotional connection was scarce, and affection came with conditions that were never fully articulated. In this landscape, Israel learned early that safety came from isolation and self-reliance, not from relationships. Unlike many serial offenders, there is little evidence that Keyes was withdrawn or visibly disturbed during adolescence. As he grew older, he adapted outwardly with remarkable ease. He learned how to mirror expectations when necessary, how to speak when spoken to, how to appear compliant without revealing anything internal. This ability to blend was not innate charm, but survival skill. He knew how to perform normality when required, and how to retreat into silence when observation became uncomfortable. This duality, engagement without attachment, would later become central to his crimes. Keyes' upbringing did not revolve around violence in an obvious way. There were no known early animal mutilations or public acts of aggression. Instead, what defined his formative years was exposure to chaos without accountability and authority without stability. The world appeared arbitrary, governed by power rather than fairness. Over time, this eroded any belief that moral systems operated consistently or deserved loyalty. Rules did not exist to be followed. They existed to be navigated. As a teenager, Keyes began exhibiting behaviors that hinted at deeper internal disturbance, though none rose to the level that might prompt intervention. He engaged in petty crimes, vandalism, theft, acts that carried risk but remained socially invisible. What was notable was not the acts themselves, but the lack of emotional reaction surrounding them. He did not appear anxious or thrill-seeking. He treated illegal behavior with the same emotional neutrality he applied to daily tasks. This flat effect was something others would later misinterpret as maturity or introversion. In his late teens, Keyes joined the U.S. Army. The decision was less about patriotism or structure and more about escape and access. Military life offered distance from his upbringing and exposure to broader geography without demanding emotional investment. It gave him an identity that required compliance but not introspection. Importantly, it also refined skills he would later weaponize: discipline, patience, navigation, and comfort with extended solitude. He learned to move through unfamiliar environments with confidence and efficiency, a skill that would later erase boundaries between states in his mind. During his time in the military, Keyes was stationed in Egypt, among other places, where exposure to foreign landscapes further detached him from regional identity. Locations became interchangeable. Cultures blurred. Movement itself became normal, even grounding. For many people, travel expands empathy. For Keyes, it reinforced anonymity. Being unknown everywhere meant he was never out of place anywhere. After leaving the military, Keyes did something that would later confound investigators and commentators alike. He built an outwardly stable adult life. He settled in Alaska, started a construction business, entered into long-term relationships, and eventually became a father. He paid bills. He showed up to work. He participated just enough to appear embedded in community life without forming deep ties. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was quiet, capable, dependable. There were no dramatic conflicts, no visible emotional volatility. Parenthood did not alter his internal world in any transformative way. It simply added another layer of compartmentalization. This outward stability obscured a deeply unsettling internal truth. By the time he had established himself as an adult, Israel Keyes had already begun fantasizing about murder with specificity and long-term intent. Unlike offenders driven by impulse or emotional collapse, Keyes approached violence as a future project. He did not rush. He did not experiment publicly. Instead, he planned years in advance, burying kill kits, containers filled with weapons, restraints, cash, and tools across vast stretches of the United States. Some of these caches were placed years before they would ever be used, if they were used at all. Planning itself became part of the gratification. What makes Keyes particularly disturbing is not the brutality of his confirmed crimes alone, but his refusal to operate within recognizable patterns. He deliberately avoided consistency. He killed in different states, sometimes far from where he lived, often flying one direction, and renting a car to travel another. He selected victims with no shared demographics beyond opportunity. Men, women, couples. Urban spaces, rural settings. His aim was to erase predictability itself, understanding that patterns are what investigators rely on to make sense of chaos. This philosophy extended beyond logistics into psychology. Keyes did not want recognition in the way many killers do. He did not seek media attention or symbolic gestures. In fact, he openly expressed contempt for killers who craved notoriety. For him, control meant remaining invisible not just to police, but to collective memory. A crime that could not be linked was a crime that did not truly exist, at least in any meaningful systemic sense. This was not just about evasion. It was about dominance over narrative. Keyes' internal world, as later revealed through interrogation and recorded conversations, was rigid, compartmentalized, and emotionally detached. He exhibited little remorse in conventional terms. When he spoke of his crimes, he did so clinically, often focusing on logistics rather than victims. Emotional language surfaced rarely and inconsistently. When it did, it tended to revolve around control, irritation, or boredom rather than guilt or empathy. This absence did not reflect psychosis or delusion. It reflected emotional flatness cultivated over years of isolation and reinforced by success in avoiding consequences. One of the most chilling aspects of Key's psychology was his relationship with time. Unlike killers driven by compulsion, he could go long periods without acting on violent urges. He believed urges intensified if acted upon too frequently, and he feared losing control through escalation. Spacing crimes allowed him to maintain stability, to return to normal life without suspicion, and to preserve the illusion, for himself, that he was not defined by violence alone. This restraint, paradoxically, made him far more dangerous. Alcohol played a role in his offenses, not as a catalyst but as a tool. He often drank heavily before acting, which he later described as necessary to lower inhibitions that otherwise kept him locked in planning mode. This suggests a core conflict, a man who desired control needing intoxication to release himself from it. Even in this contradiction, pattern emerges, not of location or victim type, but of internal permission structures carefully constructed to justify harm. By the time he committed the murder that would ultimately expose him, Keyes had already lived for years as two people occupying the same body. One was a contractor, a partner, a father, a man who mowed lawns, paid taxes, and traveled for work. The other was an invisible presence moving through highways and flights, interacting with strangers, only long enough to destroy them and disappear. These identities rarely collided because he engineered distance between them with surgical precision. If there was one element that separated Israel Keyes from almost every serial offender investigators had studied before him, it was not his brutality, nor even the geographic scale of his crimes. It was preparation. Long before he chose victims, long before he booked flights or rented cars, Keyes was already working in silence, shaping the future from beneath the ground. The kill kits were not impulsive tools grabbed in moments of rage. They were buried promises to himself, placed years in advance, waiting patiently for the right moment to be unearthed. Keyes began constructing these kits early in his adult life, long before law enforcement would ever associate his name with violence. He chose locations far from his home, often places he had never lived, sometimes states he would not return to for years. He buried them near highway exits, in rural wooded areas, close to trails or cemeteries, always choosing spots that blended into the ordinary landscape. These were not hidden places in the dramatic sense. They were forgettable places. Places no one would visit twice with intention. In Keyes' mind, forgettable was safer than remote. Each kit was carefully assembled. Inside were weapons, restraints, ammunition, plastic bags, tools for control and concealment, sometimes cash. Nothing was personalized. Nothing was traceable. There were no signatures, no ritual objects that would link one kit to another. Even the burial techniques varied slightly, not enough to draw symbols, but enough to avoid consistency. For Keyes, the goal was not efficiency alone. It was deniability stretched through time. What is most unsettling about the kill kits is not what they contained, but what they represented psychologically. To plan violence years in advance requires a particular relationship with time. Most violent offenders exist in cycles of escalation and collapse, acting under pressure and emotion. Keyes operated differently. He created distance between desire and action, allowing fantasy to mature without exposure. Burying a kit was not merely preparation, it was rehearsal. It allowed him to imagine future control without immediate consequences, a form of psychological rehearsal conducted in complete privacy. The act of burial itself mattered. Digging holes, placing objects carefully, and covering them until the ground appeared untouched mirrored the control he sought over his victims. This was domination extended beyond the act of murder, reaching into geography and future behavior. By burying kits, Keyes claimed a sense of ownership over unseen spaces, transforming neutral places into private extensions of his internal world. The earth became complicit. The landscape became storage. Unlike traditional serial killers who revisit crime scenes to relive acts, Keyes revisited potential crime scenes long before violence occurred. He returned to areas to confirm kits were still undisturbed, mentally logging their condition. These visits were quiet, often remarkable. No one watching would see anything unusual about a man standing near a trailhead or walking through trees. That invisibility was deliberate. The kits existed not to draw attention, but to remove uncertainty. When the moment came, nothing would need to be purchased, nothing stolen, nothing planned in the open. Keyes understood something investigators would only realize years later. Patterns emerge not only from action, but from procurement. Guns purchased together, rope bought in similar locations, movements tied to ownership. By divorcing preparation from execution, sometimes by years, he severed one of the strongest links law enforcement relies upon. Cameras, receipts, witnesses, all rendered useless by time and separation. The kill kits collapsed cause and effect into different ears, confusing narrative before it could form. What makes this strategy even more disturbing is that many kits were never used. Keyes admitted to burying more than he ever recovered. Some were placed simply because he had the opportunity, because the act of burial itself fed his need for control. This suggests that killing was not his only compulsion. Planning alone provided emotional regulation. The mere knowledge that violence was stored, deferred, and available offered satisfaction. In this sense, the kits were comfort objects, reminders that he controlled an unseen future. Keyes' approach to victims mirrored this philosophy. He did not select people in advance based on identity or location. Instead, he built capability first, then waited for circumstance to align. Victim selection was the final step, not the beginning. This inverted the typical offender narrative. He did not fantasize about specific individuals. He fantasized about scenarios, about systems functioning smoothly. The person who filled the role mattered less than the role itself. When travel became a part of his method, the kits allowed him to move without risk. Keyes would fly one direction, rent a car, and drive hundreds of miles to retrieve a kit buried years earlier. To law enforcement, his movements were incoherent. Flights did not align with crimes. Rental car records pointed nowhere useful. The physical tools needed for violence had already been waiting dormant and unregistered, untethered from his contemporary identity. One of the most chilling implications of the kill kits is what they reveal about Keyes' emotional discipline. He could walk past a buried kit knowing it would not be used that day. He could leave it untouched for years without anxiety. This ability to delay gratification contradicts many assumptions about violent behavior. It implies not compulsion, but cultivation. Violence for Keyes was not an uncontrollable urge. It was an option he activated strategically. The kits also represent Keyes' deep mistrust of human systems. He did not rely on anyone. No accomplices. No confidants. No online forums or communities. Even among other offenders, he expressed contempt for collaboration, seeing it as weakness. The kits ensured self-sufficiency. Everything he needed existed independently of social interaction. In this sense, they were extensions of his upbringing, isolation preserved as strategy. Law enforcement, when they later uncovered the concept of the kill kits, struggled to reconcile their scope. There was no way to locate all of them. Maps were incomplete. Memories unreliable. Some kits would remain buried forever, silent markers of violence that never occurred but was intended. This uncertainty created a chilling possibility. that the full scale of Key's planning would never be known, that some part of his future crimes had simply expired unused, sealed beneath soil and time. The philosophical dimension of the kits adds another layer of unease. By creating tools for crimes that were not yet real, Keyes existed in a liminal space between intention and action. This suspended state allowed him to maintain a sense of power without constantly confronting consequence. The kits were his way of asserting that the future belonged to him, that time could be shaped, stored, and reopened at will. It was an illusion of authorship over reality itself. Investigators later realized how profoundly the kits hindered detection. Even when bodies were found, nothing traced back. No recent purchases. No familiar weapons. No local linkage. Each crime appeared isolated, self-contained. And that was exactly how Keyes wanted it. The kits fractured continuity, ensuring that even if one act was discovered, it would not illuminate another. From the outside, the randomness of Israel Keyes' crimes looked like chaos. Victims appeared disconnected by geography, age, gender, circumstance. There were no familiar patterns to follow, no clusters that suggested escalation, no consistent setting investigators could map with confidence. But this randomness was not accidental. It was engineered. Keyes understood early that the most dangerous thing a killer can have is a pattern others can recognize. And so he designed his crimes around absence of predictability, absence of connection, absence of meaning anyone else could trace. Unlike many offenders who develop specific victim preferences rooted in personal history or fantasy, Keyes resisted fixation. He avoided narrowing his focus not because he lacked desire, but because he believed specialization created visibility. To him, preference was vulnerability. If investigators could say he targets this type, they could begin predicting behavior. So instead, he flattened all categories. Victims were selected based on proximity and opportunity rather than identity. Men, women, couples, strangers encountered briefly and never again. Each victim existed as a means to an internal end, not as an object of obsession. This philosophy had a stabilizing effect on his external life. Because victims were not tied to his emotional world, he did not carry visible residue from one crime into the next. There was no cycle of fixation that might bleed into behavior. He did not stalk individuals for long periods before acting. When he killed, it was often after brief contact, sometimes within hours of noticing someone who fit the momentary need. The lack of prolonged engagement reduced witnesses, patterns, and emotional artifacts others might notice. Keyes believed that randomness was the ultimate alibi. In later interviews, he expressed contempt for criminals who followed ritualistic methods or symbolic acts. He saw them as narcissistic, eager to leave a signature. In his view, signature was weakness. It invited recognition. It turned crime into performance. Keyes wanted crimes to appear as isolated tragedies, unrelated freak occurrences that resisted narrative cohesion. He did not want to be a character. He wanted to be an absence of connection. This approach profoundly complicated investigations. Law enforcement relies on comparison. Similarities across cases create leads. Shared victim profiles allow predictions. Shared locations reveal comfort zones. Keyes erased all of these by consciously choosing variability. If he killed a woman one time, he might kill a man the next. If he acted in a rural area once, he would avoid it next time. If he killed in winter, he might wait for summer. Each shift diluted statistical significance. His randomness also applied to timing. Unlike offenders driven by compulsion who follow internal rhythms, Keyes went long stretches without killing. Months or even years could pass between crimes. This temporal distance further fractured investigative efforts. Cases separated by time often fall into different units, different funding cycles, different investigative memory pools. When a killer waits long enough, institutional attention naturally shifts elsewhere. Keyes relied on this drift. What made this randomness particularly effective was its consistency. He applied it deliberately again and again, reinforcing illusion through repetition. Randomness, paradoxically, became his pattern, but one too abstract to be actionable. Investigators could not say what he would do next because next did not exist in a predictable sequence. His crimes did not escalate in frequency or brutality in a discernible way. They existed as isolated incidents floating in a sea of unrelated violence. The psychological cost of this strategy was isolation, but isolation suited Keyes. He did not seek validation from knowing his victims or controlling their narratives publicly. His control was internal and procedural. He wanted mastery over circumstances, not over people's memory of him. Randomness ensured that victims did not coalesce into a story others could tell. Without story, attention dissipates. Without attention, silence persists. This also affected how he remembered his victims. In later interrogations, Keyes struggled to recall names, dates, and locations unless prompted extensively. This was not memory loss so much as intentional emotional distance, because victims did not occupy specific roles in his inner narrative. They faded quickly. This distancing reinforced his ability to continue living normally. There were no faces haunting his routines, no specific memories inviting reflection. Each event was closed, sealed, and stored away without integration. Law enforcement, when they finally grasped the scope of his randomness, realized how deeply it undermined traditional profiling. Keyes did not match expected trajectories. He did not prefer symbolic locations linked to personal meaning. He did not seek vulnerable populations exclusively. He did not display ritualistic behaviors that would anchor analysis. In effect, he turned the investigative toolkit against itself, exploiting assumptions built from decades of studying offenders who behaved differently. Random victimization also allowed Keyes to maintain emotional balance. Because he did not fixate, he did not experience the cycle of anticipation and collapse seen in many serial killers. There was no crescendo demanding release. Instead, violence existed as a controlled outlet, activated occasionally to restore internal equilibrium, then sealed away. In this sense, randomness functioned as emotional management. It prevented obsession from consuming him and preserving his carefully built facade. Geography reinforced this dynamic. Crimes across different states ensured that even if similarities were noted locally, they never connected nationally. Jurisdictional silos kept information fragmented. A murder in one state might never be compared meaningfully to another hundreds of miles away. Keyes understood this structural vulnerability intuitively. He trusted not just his randomness, but the institutional limitations surrounding it. Randomness also shielded him from detection in more subtle ways. Because victims were diverse, no single community felt targeted consistently enough to maintain prolonged vigilance. Fear was diffused, attention diluted. No group could say with certainty that they were being hunted. This delayed collective response and allowed daily life to continue uninterrupted, further insulating him from scrutiny. From a moral perspective, this randomness stripped meaning from violence in a way deeply unsettling. Many crimes provoke outrage partly because they feel purposeful, directed, symbolic. Random violence resists such framing. It offers no lesson, no warning, no comfort. It feels arbitrary, making the world appear unstable. Keyes harnessed this destabilization intentionally. By refusing logic, he undermined sense-making itself. Yet this strategy contained a hidden flaw. Randomness requires discipline to maintain indefinitely. Every deviation risks coherence. Every mistake threatens exposure. As time passed, sustaining absolute variability became increasingly difficult. Internal fatigue accumulated. External stressors intruded. Alcohol became a more frequent companion. The effort required to maintain this illusion of chaos weighed on him quietly, nudging him closer to errors he believed himself immune to. Movement was not merely a logistical necessity for Israel Keyes. It was philosophy made physical. Roads, flights, layovers, rental cars, and motels were not obstacles between destinations. They were the environment in which he felt most complete. While most people experienced travel as disruption, something that fractured routine and demanded adaptation, Keyes experienced it as stability. The longer he was in motion, the further he drifted from fixed identity, and the safer he felt. In transit, no one expected to know you. In transit, no one asked why you were there. And for a man constructing his life around invisibility, movement itself became camouflage. Keyes deliberately avoided settling into patterns of travel that might attract attention. He rarely drove directly from his home to a crime scene. Instead, he built convoluted paths, flying into one state, renting a car under his own name without concern, and then driving hundreds of miles into another region entirely. This fractured trail ensured that even if his movements were later examined retroactively, they would appear nonsensical. Why would someone fly into Chicago and then drive to rural Vermont? Why rent a car for days without a clear destination? To Keyes, these questions mattered only if someone knew to ask them. And for years, no one did. Airports were particularly useful to him because of their anonymity. Faces blurred together in terminals. Everyone was tired. Everyone was distracted. Boarding passes and IDs were checked briefly and then forgotten. Keyes understood that surveillance footage meant nothing without cause, that thousands passed through daily without follow-up. He used airports not as gateways to destinations, but as resets, points where his narrative dissolved and reformed somewhere else entirely. When he landed, he was not arriving, he was disappearing. Rental cars played a similar role. They were temporary identities on wheels, detached from ownership and personal history. Mileage accumulated without context. Movements left footprints no one would follow unless forced to. Keyes often drove aimlessly for hours, sometimes days, before committing a crime or retrieving a buried kit. These drives were not wasted time. They allowed him to observe environments, to feel their isolation, to identify where light faded and where people stopped paying attention. The long hours on dark highways were meditative rather than exhausting. For him, the road erased responsibility. Motels marked points of rest without attachment. He favored places that looked interchangeable: beige walls, thin curtains, buzzing lights. Locations where one room blurred into the next. He did not want charm. He wanted forgettability. Staff turnover ensured faces were rarely remembered twice. Receipts were routine. Payment was unremarkable. Everything about these spaces supported the idea that presence was temporary and therefore unimportant. What makes Keyes' traveling particularly unsettling is how seamlessly it coexisted with his domestic life. He did not vanish emotionally before or after trips. There were no dramatic farewells or reunions. He traveled for work, for errands, for vague reasons that needed no justification. His partners did not suspect because there was nothing to suspect. Travel was integrated into his routine with complete emotional neutrality. He could return from a journey involving violence and resume ordinary conversation as though nothing more than distance separated him from home. Travel also served as an emotional buffer. By committing crimes far from where he lived, Keyes ensured that reminders did not bleed into daily life. Streets did not haunt him. Neighborhoods remained neutral. This separation allowed him to preserve the illusion of normality for himself as much as for others. Unlike killers who anchor violence to familiar terrain, Keyes treated geography as disposable. A place mattered only so long as it supported anonymity. Another critical aspect of his travel was weather. Darkness extended longer in certain seasons. Snow muted sound. Rain erased footprints. Keyes paid attention to these details, timing movement to align with environmental cover. He often acted at night, not out of symbolism, but practicality. Darkness flattened difference. Everyone became a silhouette. Movement became less curious. Presence became harder to define. In later interrogations, investigators noted how frequently Keyes spoke about driving without destination. These journeys were not always tied to killing. Sometimes he traveled simply to maintain familiarity with motion. Travel content. It structured time. It provided sensory input without social demand. For a man uncomfortable with emotional intimacy, vehicles offered solitude without consequence. The hum of tires on asphalt replaced human connection. The road never asked questions. From an investigative perspective, his mobility shattered coherence. Cases that might have been linked through geography simply never overlapped jurisdictionally. A disappearance here, a body there. No common thread visible to local departments. Keyes exploited the reality that law enforcement infrastructure was not designed to track people who moved unpredictably across state lines without committing obvious crimes along the way. Travel, done legally and quietly, created blind spots that even advanced systems struggled to penetrate. Importantly, travel also reinforced his sense of superiority. Each successful return without suspicion validated his philosophy. Movement worked. Distance worked. Randomness worked. These successes deepened confidence and eroded caution. Over time, travel shifted from strategy to identity. He was not merely someone who moved around. He was someone undefined by place. And in that placelessness, he believed himself untouchable. But travel is also exhausting. It introduces variables beyond control. Fatigue accumulates. Awareness dulls. Familiarity breeds complacency. As years passed, Keyes began spending longer periods on the road, drinking more heavily during travel, relying increasingly on alcohol to manage internal conflict. The anonymous spaces that once grounded him now also loosened restraint. Motion still concealed him, but it also eroded discipline. For years, Israel Keyes' crimes existed primarily as absences. People vanished. Connections failed to form. Families were left with silence, but no concrete narrative to confront. This invisibility protected him, allowing time to wash away suspicion and blur accountability. But the disappearance of Samantha Koenig in 2012 would fracture that shield and wheeze he had not anticipated. Unlike previous crimes, this one would tether his actions to place, person, and consequence so tightly that randomness could no longer disguise intent. Samantha Koenig was a young barista working a late shift at a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. Her life, like so many others, existed entirely outside the dark logic that governed Keyes' internal world. On the night she disappeared, nothing distinguished it from countless nights before. The setting was mundane, illuminated by fluorescent lights rather than shadow. There was no remote forest, no highway exit far from witnesses. The ordinariness of the moment proved fatal to the illusion of safety Keyes had relied upon. This was not a boundary he usually crossed. Key's decision-making leading up to this crime reveals the first significant deviation from his long-standing strategy. Phase separation, the careful division between planning, execution, and aftermath, began to collapse. Alcohol played a stronger role. Fatigue eroded patience. Environmental familiarity replaced distance. Unlike earlier crimes committed far from home, this act occurred within his own community. The psychological firewall he had maintained between violence and daily life began to disintegrate. Once Samantha was taken, Keyes attempted to reassert control through procedure. He believed method could compensate for proximity. But the very closeness of the crime introduced variables he was unused to managing. Surveillance cameras captured movements. Cell phone signals traced paths. Financial transactions left trails. Unlike yours buried beneath forests and soil, these breadcrumbs could be followed in real time. Systems he once exploited for invisibility were now quietly documenting his behavior. In a further break from past patterns, Keyes initiated communication. Ransom demands followed, introducing exposure through financial institutions and law enforcement coordination. Every step required interaction. Every interaction required timing. Time, which had always been his ally, now narrowed perception instead of blurring it. The longer events unfolded, the more likely systems would converge. His belief that control could be maintained purely through precision overlooked how many institutions now overlapped: banking, telecommunications, surveillance, and coordinated policing. Investigators responded with urgency rarely afforded in earlier cases. Samantha's disappearance triggered an immediate and intense search. The difference mattered. Cameras were reviewed quickly. Data was pulled before decay. Witness memory was fresh. The mechanisms that once failed strangers now activated fully. For the first time, Keyes encountered resistance not as delayed speculation, but as coordinated response. His crimes had finally intersected with a system prepared to act in real time. This collision exposed the fragility of his philosophy. Randomness cannot withstand scrutiny when variables contract. The broader his target geography had been, the safer he felt. Anchorage compressed everything. Movement was limited. Familiarity worked against him. Investigators tracked routes, correlated timelines, and identified anomalies. Rental car records, previously meaningless across states, became meaningful within a single region. Cell phone pings mapped behavior in detail. His movements ceased to blur into noise and instead aligned into narrative. The arrest, when it came, carried no drama. There was no chase, no confrontation. It was procedural, almost anticlimactic. This quietness mirrored his capture psychologically. Control was not seized violently. It dissipated. The systems he believed he had mastered simply continued operating, indifferent to his assumptions. Once apprehended, he no longer occupied the role of unseen operator. He became subject rather than actor. In custody, Keyes' demeanor shifted subtly. The precision that once defined his conduct was replaced by strategic communication. He spoke not to explain, but to manage outcome. Interrogators described him as deliberate, guarded, and calculating. He disclosed information selectively, understanding that knowledge equaled leverage. His cooperation was not remorse-based. It was transactional. He wanted terms, control, limits. Samantha Koenig's case differed from earlier crimes not only because it led to his capture, but because it illuminated cracks in a system of restraint he had built meticulously over decades. Emotional fatigue, increased reliance on alcohol, geographic contraction, risk tolerance creeping upward. These factors converged into a moment where randomness could no longer protect him. The crime became personal in a way he had long avoided. For investigators, the case lifted a curtain that revealing years of hidden preparation. Kill kits, travel routes, caches buried years earlier, crimes spanning states without connection. What initially appeared as a single tragic event expanded into something sprawling and terrifying. Samantha's disappearance was no longer isolated. It was a doorway. Families of unidentified victims experienced conflicting emotions as the scope became apparent. Relief mixed with renewed grief. The realization that justice had finally found a killer did not erase the knowledge that many victims remained unnamed, their stories untold except through the fragments Keyes chose to reveal. Closure arrived unevenly, if at all. What makes this segment especially haunting is how subtle the turning point was. There was no dramatic mistake born of ego. No taunt. No signature flourish. Just small deviations accumulating until systems could no longer ignore them. Keyes did not fail because he abandoned strategy. He failed because strategy cannot fully control time, fatigue, proximity, and chance simultaneously. The world eventually resists being held that tightly. When Israel Keyes entered the interrogation room, there was none of the visible collapse that popular culture often associates with capture. No shaking hands, no obvious panic, no sudden outpour of denial or rage. Instead, he seated himself calmly, shoulders relaxed, eyes alert, already calculating the new environment he now occupied. If travel had once been his refuge, this small, enclosed room became his latest terrain to navigate. The process of interrogation did not frighten him. What concerned him was loss of control, and control, he believed, was something that could still be negotiated. From the outset, Keyes understood that silence alone would not serve him. Total refusal to speak would only invite pressure, extended isolation, and eventual exposure without influence. At the same time, full confession would eliminate the leverage he still possessed. He chose a third path, partial cooperation, offering fragments that suggested depth without revealing scope. This approach mirrored his operational style precisely: reveal nothing unnecessary, disclose strategically, and keep others guessing. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with an individual who did not respond to traditional interrogation tactics. Threats failed. Emotional appeals slid past him without traction. Even confrontation with evidence did not provoke visible stress. Keyes processed information quietly, often pausing before responding, not to search for words, but to weigh outcomes. He spoke when it served him, withheld when it did not, and adjusted tone to the rhythm of the room. A defining characteristic of these interrogations was Keyes' fixation on control of narrative. He resisted timelines. He avoided naming victims unless necessary. He spoke in abstractions, referring to events rather than people, situations rather than actions. When pushed for detail, he often deflected to logistics rather than emotion. This distancing was not merely psychological defense. It was tactic. Emotional specificity creates attachment. Attachment anchors memory. Keyes wanted neither. Alcohol emerged repeatedly in discussions of his crimes, not as an excuse, but as a mechanism. He described drinking as a necessary condition, a way to loosen internal restraints that otherwise prevented action. This admission troubled investigators because it framed violence as contingent rather than inevitable, something he believed he might have avoided had he chosen differently, even as evidence suggested otherwise. The implication was chilling. Control had always been present. He simply elected to disable it. As interrogations continued, a second unsettling pattern emerged. Keyes expressed disdain toward other serial killers, particularly those who sought media recognition. He believed their desire for fame represented weakness. For him, The act itself mattered far more than acknowledgement. This contempt reinforced his earlier operational philosophy. Invisibility was superiority. Speaking now, under arrest, did not contradict that belief. He was not chasing recognition. He was bargaining. The bargaining was methodical. Keyes tested what information investigators valued. He gauged reactions. When a small disclosure elicited urgency, he noted it. When silence produced discomfort, he banked the reaction. Over time, this allowed him to calibrate the pace of confession, trading information for improved conditions, limited exposure, and psychological comfort. Cooperation became currency. Investigators, for their part, faced an unprecedented challenge. They understood that pressing too aggressively might shut him down, but allowing too much control risked manipulation. The central ethical dilemma mirrored that of the Green River case. How much agency can you give a man responsible for immense harm in order to recover truths that might otherwise remain hidden forever? Each interview walked a careful line between extraction and concession. Keyes' emotional presentation remained disturbingly flat throughout. When he acknowledged murder, there was no visible remorse. When he described victims, he did not personalize them. Yet there were moments when something closer to irritation surfaced, not at the crimes themselves, but at inconvenience. He expressed frustration when interrogations cut into routine, when questions felt repetitive, when attention lingered too long on one detail. This revealed something essential. Even in custody, his primary concern was efficiency. As sessions progressed, investigators became increasingly aware of the limits of his candor. Certain topics produced rigidity. When pressed for numbers, he deflected. When asked to identify all victims, he resisted. He claimed forgetting. He cited intoxication. He appealed to emotional exhaustion. It became clear that full confession would never materialize. The truth, like the kill kits, would remain partially buried. One of the most disturbing aspects of these interrogations was how detached Keyes remained from consequences. Even as evidence mounted linking him to multiple homicides, his focus stayed inward. He discussed his daughter, his discomfort with confinement, his routines disrupted. Victims did not occupy moral space. They occupied logistical space. In this framework, confession was not admission of wrongdoing, but acknowledgement of fact. Over time, the tone of interrogation shifted. Investigators began focusing on containment rather than collapse. They aimed to extract as much verifiable information as possible before psychological fatigue or resistance solidified permanently. This urgency was not lost on Keyes. He became increasingly selective, doling out details sparingly, as though each were finite resources subject to depletion. Behind this entire process lay a deeper tension, the fear that Keyes might end the narrative on his own terms. His obsession with control extended to life itself. His statements hinted at despair not rooted in guilt, but in confinement. Freedom of movement, the axis around which his identity had rotated, was now removed. The very function that stabilized him emotionally was gone. Investigators understood this vulnerability too well. As interrogation tapes accumulated, analysts noted the contrast between Keyes' articulate planning and emotional emptiness. He was not delusional. He was not dissociated. He was precise, deliberate, and disturbingly self-aware. The absence of remorse was not a symptom of madness. It was absence cultivated over time. Once Israel Keyes realized that freedom of movement would never be restored, his understanding of control shifted inward. The highways were gone, the airports replaced by locked corridors and metal doors. The endless anonymity provided by travel had been compressed into the small geometry of a cell. And yet, even here, Control remained the organizing principle of his inner world. It did not vanish when he was captured. It adapted. Confinement stripped away the external systems that had defined his philosophy for years. No more rental cars, no departure boards, no places that forgot him. But what remained was authorship over narrative. What would be known, what would remain hidden, what would be confirmed, and what would dissolve into speculation. Keyes understood something fundamental about investigations. Truth is not merely discovered, it is negotiated. And as long as he could decide which truths emerged and when, he remained an active participant rather than a resolved subject. In custody, Keyes monitored information with the same discipline he had applied to his crimes. He calculated the weight of every statement. He assessed reaction carefully. He learned quickly which questions mattered most to investigators and which provoked urgency rather than curiosity. Cooperation, when it came, arrived in fragments, enough to suggest collaboration, never enough to relinquish leverage entirely. Silence remained a tool, not a refusal. What investigators came to understand was that Keyes' greatest fear was not punishment. Life sentences, even execution, were abstract outcomes to someone who had lived psychologically detached from consequence for years. His fear was erasure. To die without control over his story would render his identity meaningless in his own estimation. This was not a desire for fame, but a refusal to be interpreted entirely by others. He did not want to be mythologized inaccurately nor forgotten anonymously. He wanted containment without distortion. This tension defined the latter phase of his interactions with authorities. He resisted providing comprehensive confessions precisely because full disclosure would transfer narrative authority away from him. Every undisclosed victim represented remaining control. Every undisclosed location preserved authorship. Investigators recognized this, but were constrained by ethical and practical limits. They could not compel memory, nor could they extract what he chose not to give. Over time, isolation took a psychological toll separate from guilt or fear. Deprivation of movement removed the sensory regulation travel had provided. Noise patterns changed. Days lost texture. Alcohol, once a chemical switch that allowed him to act, was now absent. He confronted what he had spent his life avoiding, stillness without anonymity. Stillness demanded confrontation with self, not remorse necessarily, but awareness of containment. And containment was humiliating. Keyes responded to this pressure by exerting control where he still could. He adjusted eating habits. He manipulated routines. He withheld cooperation selectively to influence conditions. But these acts provided diminishing relief. The larger structure of confinement resisted modulation. The silence he once controlled now enveloped him without permission. As trial preparation wound, the balance of power narrowed further. Once proceedings moved forward, his opportunity to trade information would evaporate. Outcomes would be dictated by legal process rather than negotiation. For a man whose identity had revolved around shaping events from the shadows, this transition was unbearable. The idea of standing still while others spoke definitively about his life marked the final collapse of his preferred existence. In the final weeks, signals emerged that investigators now recognize as warnings. Keyes became withdrawn. He stopped engaging strategically. He began limiting communication. Where once he calibrated responses carefully, now he offered less. This was not resignation. It was predecision. He did not express despair openly. Instead, a quiet finality settled into his posture. Control was being reallocated internally. The act itself, when it occurred, wasn't surprising in retrospect. Israel Keyes ended his life in custody, leaving behind writings that reflected fixation rather than regret. Poems, references to darkness, fragments of thought that preserved identity rather than apologized for harm. This was not a plea for understanding. It was closure on his terms. By choosing death, he ensured that no courtroom narrative could override his internal authorship. To investigators, the death represented both termination and loss. The opportunity to recover more remains vanished instantly. Questions that might have been answered were sealed permanently. Locations of kill kits, undisclosed victims, unrecovered evidence, all frozen in uncertainty. The man who had spent decades manufacturing absence now created one final absence himself. For families of victims, the impact was deeply uneven. Some felt denied the confrontation they had long awaited. Others were relieved that no further waiting would be required. But universally, the suicide underscored a brutal truth. Control had not been wrested from him completely. He had maintained it to the final moment. Public reaction oscillated between outrage and resignation. Media coverage framed the act as cowardice, defiance, inevitability. Yet none of these labels fully captured the significance of the choice. This was not simply an escape from punishment. It was the culmination of a worldview obsessed with autonomy at any cost. Keyes could not tolerate an ending authored by others. Psychologically, the act aligned seamlessly with his life trajectory. He avoided exposure. He resisted categorization. He rejected frameworks imposed externally. Ending his life prevented exhaustive analysis, ensured ambiguity, and preserved mystery. It was consistent in the most disturbing way possible. For criminologists, the conclusion left enduring unease. Israel Keyes challenged foundational assumptions about serial offenders. He was not chaotic. He was not escalatory in predictable ways. He did not seek recognition. He prepared more than he acted. And in the end, he withheld resolution as thoroughly as he had withheld patterns. When Israel Keyes died, the investigation did not end so much as it froze in place. There was no dramatic closing chapter, no final revelation that tied together the scattered remnants of his life and crimes. Instead, what remained was a map, not a complete one, but a fractured outline marked by unanswered questions, unverified confessions, and vast stretches of blank space. This empty map would become the true legacy of the Keyes case, a geography defined not by what was known, but by what would never be filled in. In the immediate aftermath of his death, investigators were left with a profound sense of interruption. Interrogations that had unfolded slowly, deliberately, stopped mid-sentence. Leads that depended entirely on his cooperation evaporated. Locations half described, numbers vaguely suggested, timelines gestured toward but never confirmed all became static, immune to further probing. Unlike cases where death closes a chapter through exhaustion of evidence, Keyes' death actively removed the final source of clarity. Evidence still existed, but its interpreter was gone. Law enforcement agencies began the painstaking process of reconstructing what they could without him. Travel records were re-examined with fresh urgency. Rental car logs, flight manifests, bank withdrawals, and hotel stays were layered over missing person databases in the hope that patterns might emerge posthumously. This effort produced fragments, but rarely confusions. Too many variables overlapped. Too much time had passed. His deliberate randomness continued doing its quiet work even in absence. The most unsettling realization to emerge from this phase was how effectively Keyes had designed his crimes to outlive interrogation. The kill kits buried across the country remain largely unaccounted for. Some may still lie beneath forest floors or near forgotten trails, their contents corroding slowly. Others may have been unknowingly destroyed by construction, erosion, or human activity. Each unrecovered cache represents not just an unrealized crime, but a deliberate act of future planning that will never be fully understood. These artifacts were not evidence of acts committed alone, but of violence intended, intentions preserved in soil beyond the reach of justice. For families searching for loved ones who vanished under circumstances that now feel hauntingly ambiguous, the empty map deepened uncertainty. Some hoped that after Key's death, investigators might discover hidden records or journals offering direction. What surfaced instead were writings focused inward, expressions of identity, fixation, and emotional closure that revealed little about those he harmed. The absence of usable detail felt like a final abandonment. Hope, which had surged briefly during his capture, flattened again into familiar silence. Communities, indirectly touched by his movements, experienced a quieter reckoning. People learned that violence could pass through without imprint, that safety assumed through familiarity or routine was often illusory. The idea that someone could traverse states, interact briefly with strangers, and leave devastation without pattern unsettled long-held beliefs about how danger announces itself. The Keyes case reframed safety as something far more fragile, dependent not on recognizing threats, but on anticipating their absence. Criminologists and behavioral analysts continue to study the case, not because it offers neat lessons, but because it resists them. Israel Keyes does not fit comfortably into established models of serial offending. He was not driven by fantasy collapse, nor by a need for recognition. He avoided ritual, signature, and consistent victim profiles. He demonstrated patience, restraint, and long-term planning rarely observed together. Most disturbingly, he integrated this capacity seamlessly into an outwardly functional life. The tension between normalcy and hidden intent remains unresolved, forcing ongoing reassessment of assumptions once thought reliable. The empty map is also moral territory. It forces confrontation with uncomfortable questions about how societies prioritize danger, how institutions respond to disappearance, and how much harm can occur before systems adapt meaningfully. Many of Keyes' suspected victims lived in spaces already neglected, transient populations, isolated individuals, people whose absences were not immediately alarming. The lack of urgency surrounding missing persons did not create his crimes, but it allowed them to disappear into administrative silence. The map is empty not just because Keyes withheld information, but because structural gaps existed long before he exploited them. Time continues to erode potential answers. Witnesses age. Landscapes change. DNA degrades or becomes irrelevant without context. Every year that passes places greater distance between what might have been known and what remains possible. Occasionally, new connections are suggested, a timeline overlap here, a possible travel correlation there, but confirmation remains elusive. In a case so deliberately constructed to resist cohesion, probability rarely reaches certainty. There is a temptation, especially in retelling, to turn the empty map into myth, to fill silence with speculation, to imagine scale beyond evidence. But restraint is necessary here. Overstatement risks recreating the illusion of control Keyes sought. What is known must remain separate from what is suspected. The power of the case lies precisely in its incompleteness, in how much remains unknowable without him. For those affected directly, acceptance arrives unevenly, if at all. Some families choose to memorialize absence itself, creating space for remembrance without resolution. Others continue advocating for systemic change, hoping future cases will move faster, connect sooner, and fragment less. Their efforts reflect a lesson drawn not from clarity, but from loss, that waiting for patterns can cost lives when violence works without them. The landscapes tied to this case remain deceptively ordinary. Highways stretch uninterrupted. Parks welcome visitors. Snow falls and melts. Forests thicken. In many of these places, nothing indicates what once occurred there or what might have been planned. This ordinariness is not comforting. It underscores how easily violence can coexist with daily life, how little the environment resists becoming complicit through silence. Israel Keyes wanted nothing more than to leave no coherent story behind. In many ways, he succeeded. The empty map stands as proof of a strategy built on disconnection, one that resisted forensic reconstruction even after capture. Yet that success is partial. The map may lack detail, but its outline exists. His name is known. His methods are studied. His victims, named and unnamed, are remembered. Control, in the end, was imperfect. The final absence he created did not collapse the search entirely, nor did it erase responsibility. It shifted focus from resolution to prevention, from understanding one man fully to recognizing the conditions that allowed him to operate. If there is any completion available here, it lies not in answers, but in vigilance, in refusing to let disappearance remain invisible, and in treating silence as something that must be examined rather than accepted. As the story concludes, no neat ending presents itself. There is only the map, partially drawn, unfinished, resistant to completion. Roads run through it. Cities dot its edges. Blank spaces dominate the center. And within those spaces remain questions that will never receive direct answers, echoing quietly beneath layers of movement, time, and forgetting. This is the legacy of Israel Keyes. Not a mythology, not a spectacle, but an absence deliberately manufactured and only partially undone. The empty map remains, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a warning that some forms of violence thrive not on chaos, but on patience, planning, and a world too accustomed to believing that danger leaves patterns behind.